Okay.
Distinguished dear colleagues, I'm very, very happy, very glad that I can welcome you to Jagiellonian University at the Faculty of International and Political Studies for your research group meeting, research group workshop, Heritage and Mobility in the Multisensory Perspective. And please let me say 2 or 3 words about the Critical Heritage Studies Hub, because your project, in fact, operates within the broader project, exactly Critical Heritage Studies Hub. And so the main aims of this, our hub, is to conduct interdisciplinary research in the broader cooperation. And thanks to you, also your involvement, we can do it. We are working on it for more than 1 year. And when I look at the schedule of your today and tomorrow's venue, I'm convinced absolutely that these aims, so interdisciplinary research and cooperation, broader cooperation, are fulfilled. It is wonderful that experts from so many countries, from Belgium and Brazil, from Italy, Germany, Norway, Portugal, Poland, and Singapore are participating in the event, in this meeting. I promise myself not to enlarge this introduction, but please let me say thank you. Many thanks to persons who organized this meeting, to Magdalena, to Carolina, to Elżbieta. Many, many thanks to you for your huge work and involvement. And I would like to thank you also to Anna Dragan. She's not present with us. Perhaps you know her from emails. And without her organizational support, we couldn't meet here. Thank you very much, and I wish you fruitful and interesting discussion. All the best, and have a nice day in the past.
Thank you. Thank you, Maciej, for this nice welcome and introduction. I also welcome you. I welcome our distinguished guest, Professor Kelvin Law from the National University of Singapore. Kelvin is the head of the Department of Sociology at the National University of Sociology and Anthropology at the National University of Singapore. And he also serves as a president of the thematic group Senses and Society within the International Sociological Association. He is with us to deliver a lecture based on his latest book titled Sensory Anthropology, Culture and Experiences in Asia. The lecture is titled Crafting Sensory Anthropology, the Senses and Social Life in Asia. We invited Kelvin because his research combines what is very crucial for this seminar, the issues of heritage and mobility, especially migration, and very important for us today, but also for contemporary anthropology and sociology, and generally cultural studies, multisensory perspective. Kelvin, the floor is yours. We welcome you again, and please.
Thank you very much. Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm from Singapore. It's actually good afternoon. I just want to begin by thanking the organizers, especially Carolina, Magdalena, and Elżbieta for bringing us all together. And 2 apologies before I begin. The first of which is that I'm absolutely sorry I can't be there, in Krakow with all of you. I remember my last visit to Krakow in Jagiellonian University was in 2015, and that was really a very pleasant and fruitful travel there. I wish I could be there with everyone, but because of various circumstances, I've had to share my work through online MS Teams instead. The second apology comes because of my voice. Sorry that I'm a bit under the weather, so I hope the sensory challenge is for me rather than for colleagues, if you can hear me clearly. So I wanted to thank the organizers again for this wonderful opportunity to share my latest book, which came out just last month, which is titled Sensory Anthropology, Culture and Experience in Asia. And through that, I wanted to share the slides that I prepared for today. Can you see them?
Yes,
okay,
yes,
I wanted to share, thank you. I wanted to share ideas on how I've put together this book through this title for today, Crafting Sensory Anthropology, the Senses and Social Life in Asia. So based on the book, which has a slightly different title, my interest in sensory studies, as with broader sensory scholarship, is anchored in the social sciences and in humanities. However, the focus is mainly either on Euro-American contexts or on non-industrial societies. There seems to be a lack in both primary and secondary research, especially on non-Western contexts. So although there are many sensory depictions that are found in different genres of writing on Asia, they mainly remain at the level of description, or what David House would call surface impression. The wider scholarship still seems to be shy of some deeper examinations of their sociocultural significance. And that possibility can run across a whole gamut of domains, from morality to religious beliefs, race, class, gender dynamics, as well as power relations. So through this book, I indicate my ethnographic interests in Asia as a key context for theorizing sensory empirical phenomena. Now, how then can one regard Asia as a region of focus and how to approach it for sensory theorization? My emphasis on Asia lies within the different sensory practices and interfaces that occurs within the region and also beyond. So I am intrigued by the dynamics of sensory encounters that are not only rooted to a specific locale, but which are grounded in cultural frameworks emanating from Asian societies. So thereby availing the possibility to compare with non-Asian frames where relevant. Now, if I take Asia to be a product of interaction with other regions, now this view would also parenthetically carve out further trans-regional analytical space for addressing sensory mobilities in terms of diaspora and migration as well. As we understand and know Asia, it is a densely populous region. It is steeped in religious traditions, philosophies, linguistic practices that both converge and diverge across different webs of connectivities and relationships. And therefore, Asia and its connected historical context would serve as a fertile cross-cultural site for developing newer theoretical interventions in examining sensory knowledge and practice. Now, to build on my study of senses in Asia, I want to refer back to extant works on sensory history. So works on how sensory relations and experiences transpire in historical context are crucial because, one, they accord knowledge on how societies in earlier times regard the senses. They also provide opportunities to trace shifts and changes in sensory practices. Therefore, they add importantly to the meaningfulness and social significance of history, as well as to inform how we understand contemporary cultures and contexts. So I think colleagues in the room would appreciate and be aware of such important works in sensory scholarship, such as this one by Alan Corbin, The Fall and the Fragrant, which is about France in the 17th and 1800s. He explores different range of ideas, including class sensibilities and stench, olfactory vigilance in public arenas, issues to do with health and hygiene, as well as social control and discipline. So these are similar domains or terrain of inquiry that my book aims to add on to, if not contribute. And another existing work would be that of sensory historian Mark M. Smith, who's written, amongst many other things, the title that you see here, Sensing the Past. Now, I'd like to borrow from his idea of how to approach what a sensory history might entail. Right, so the 4 points that you see on the screen here has to do with how one should historicize a particular sense, including how it is constructed socioculturally, right? But beyond that, I'd like to go further to also address intersensory relations. I'll explain that in a little while. We also have to think about how sense perception unfolds in a particular context and climate, of which it influences people's experience, both in the past and to which I add in the present. So being on the same page with Smith, I acknowledge that less research is conducted on the non-West, but what's important to put forward is what kinds of questions should we be asking then? How are we able to theorize the senses in Asia? So this is my response, the one of which is to think about how the hegemony, if not the visibility of the Western five sensory model, continues to overlay sensory scholarship by and large. And there are different points, entry points that I'm also borrowing from David House, from Constance Classen, on how to rethink beyond the Western model, right? So we are not just interested in counting the number of senses. So it's not just an exercise in enumeration, but rather the symbolism, the social significance, not just one sense, but the different types of one sense within a particular culture, and how they are also emplaced within different social hierarchies, right? So I think engaging with these queries would allow one to move quite profitably away from the Euro-American model, and also to critically examine and unpack different cultural practices and ideologies. So to continue my very brief overview of existing works on senses and history, I now come to House and Classen, recognized as leading figures in the field of anthropology of the senses. And it's quite interesting to see how they've deployed a joint anthropological and historical methodology to cover the different social spheres of everyday life, running from medicine to art and to law. Now, what's exciting for me is that such an approach avails for cross-cultural comparability. And this is important because we acknowledge both the porosity as well as the mobility of the senses. So I wanted to reiterate here again as that I take Asia as a product of interaction with other regions, and therefore that shows up potential inter-Asian connections and comparison, and also to take Asia not as a unitary continent, but as a continent that comes with multiple frames of cultural perception and reference. So the direction of the book is to problematize the dynamics of sensory encounters that are grounded in cultural frameworks emanating from Asian societies. Now, to do that, I rely on different sources of data that I've collated and amalgamated over the years to look at different existing ethnographies, as well as different genres beyond academic scholarship to think about literature, novels, life history, folk tales, myths, and legends, and also the archives, right, as an important repository of information and glimpses into the social life of the senses. Perhaps on a more personal level would be travel writing as well as letters that all together encapsulate how the senses were deployed and what sort of resonances might they have in today's context. So these would all be in line with what Mark Smith argued concerning how print constitutes the principal medium through which we can access the senses of the past and present and their meanings. So together, these sources would highlight sensory encounters among different social groups or classes, and I take these ethnographic accounts as socio-historical data as a body of data for sensory analysis. In the interest of time and scope of discussion, I wanted to limit today's presentation to 3 out of the 5 theoretical propositions that I've built into the book. Depending on how time runs, I hope to be able to sneak in a 4th one. So let's see how that goes. So these theoretical propositions, the 3 out of 5, for me, are a systematic way to embark on sensory anthropology of Asia, and also to respond and continue from existing scholarship that focuses mainly on Western cultures. So the first one has to do with models and modalities, where in my attempt to go beyond the 5 senses model, I query what else constitutes a sense. Could it be the sense of balance, or could it be the domain of bodily energies as we can find them in Java, Indonesia? What about the senses vis-a-vis cultural diversity? How do we appreciate the different senses, their varied modalities across different frames of sense experience? So that's the first theoretical proposition or theme. The second has to do with morality. I ask, how is morality expressed through sensory idioms and behavior? How does answering that question shed light on moral socialities of self and of community? The third theme has to do with how contexts of colonialism, of migration in history and in contemporary times provide the platform for interrogating sensory interfaces as well as negotiations of different sensory reasoning. So this is my agenda for today's talk, and then I wanted to venture into a history and anthropology of the senses through these different theoretical lines of inquiry. Just a bit more background as in how I conceive of anthropology of the senses in Asia and how that is a response to existing scholarship. Now, when we comprehend sensory formations in non-Western societies, that requires not only Western theorization, but importantly, that of those ideas that are developed within the society that is being studied, right? So this is where the work of Alatas, my colleague, becomes instructive. Now, where he argues that, and I borrow, a concrete step towards a sensory anthropology and history of Asia should attend to, I quote, indigenous, local, and regional ideas and concepts, end quote, about the sociocultural significance and relevance of different sensory models. I therefore take my earlier 3 theoretical propositions as concrete moves towards sensory relevance in terms of analysis that's grounded on the basis of what the senses mean in the context in which they transpire. So to localize this idea. Now, I'll give a brief example of what I mean by relevance and context through Huang's work on 19th century Shanghai. Now, her study of Shanghai in historical times shore up this whole urban landscape of filthy streets, stench of manure, rubbish heaps that are smelling so bad to the Western nose, and were regarded as antithetical to modernity. But human waste is actually important, and it contains economic value, at least in Chinese agricultural tradition and practices, right? So where on the one hand, colonizers see the need to eradicate filth and stench, that represents the imposition of one's sensibilities onto others, and which is reflective of power relations at work. On the other hand, such imposition, in my view, counts as a case of epistemological irrelevance, right? Social actors, they differ in what will constitute as sensory modernity or sensory civilization. Therefore, importantly, relevance and context are crucial, and we therefore should focus on differentiated terminology, differentiated discourses, and it is precisely due to the asymmetric attention on Asian context that undergirds the theoretical impetus for the book. So with that, I wanted to begin now with the first theoretical theme, which is that of models and modalities. So one starting point would be for me to investigate, as a point of departure, linguistic descriptors of the senses. However, I remind that this is not only an exercise in description or enumeration, rather language is harnessed to identify different senses, including their variant cultural nuances. So I analyze sensory nomenclature in a threefold manner. First, I engage with the numbers of modalities per sense in order to acknowledge alternate sensory models that go beyond the hegemonic Romano-Grecian five-sense categorization. Second, I query the social significance of the nuances of each sense. And third, I raise examples of how two or more senses may be employed synesthetically. So this three-pronged approach already goes beyond just counting or describing, right? The sense and its accompanying modalities. Let's go first to Eastern Indonesia in borrowing the work of Kuipers 91. We understand that Aristotle's taste vocabulary, right, comprising sweet, sour, right down to pungent or harsh, may not always readily reflect upon taste sensations of other cultures. So in that sense, Western notions are not always compatible with local sensory epistemology, as evidenced through the differentiated sensory nomenclature or vernacular, as I will also illustrate later. Here, what we have an example from Kuipers is that of the descriptor for mint plant, as rough translation describes it as having the taste of mint plant. So it's an approximation, but the more important point to take away with is that taste is a rich as well as multimodal experience for which such a Western figure as Aristotle and his vocabulary of taste may fall short in describing taste sensations and its accompanying modalities in different other cultures. Now, another way of comparing the five senses, five models of the West versus other models is through Gini's work on early Chinese thought, from the era of 5th to 3rd century BCE. Now, Gini's work notes that even if early Chinese thought referred, to the fivefold classification of the senses, the Western model, it differs from it in some other ways. As we are aware, vision is very much privileged in Plato's, in Descartes' perception models, while the eyes and ears were of parallel importance in Chinese philosophy. So quite an interesting distinction there. In Chinese philosophy, the eyes and ears were ranked above the other senses in terms of their audio-visual pairing in relation to the acquisition of knowledge, right? The senses have also been labeled as the five officials, thereby portraying them as controlled and orderly, and includes the heart, mind, and body as the fourth and fifth senses, respectively. So these and other examples that one can draw from early Chinese thought would reiterate as well as the requisite for a more sustained analysis of how different cultures derive and interpret their own sense models, even if they may borrow from the hegemonic Pantet Western model. Now, to go further on the idea of the sense of sight, I wanted to use the next examples to illustrate how one sense can be comprehended through its variant modalities, and thereby to also emphasize the different symbolic associations accompanying vision. Here we have Bat. His work discusses two different notions of seeing pertaining to the Hindu milieu, where worshippers, they aim to have the darshan or sight of the deity's murti or image. This is where devotees, now they both want to see and be seen by their deities in order to embark on the road to salvation. So the sense of sight is both to see and be seen, for which both carry religious symbolism. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, now the deity's glance can as well be destructive instead of being benevolent or instead of being positive. The example that Beck shows us is that of Shiva's third eye, which he says, I quote, can reduce the god of love to ashes, or will consume the whole world in fire, at the end of the cosmic cycle, end quote. So interestingly, where devotees both want to see and be seen by deities, deities carry both benevolent as well as destructive gazes. So quite an interesting way to think about vision beyond perception, beyond seeing. Because in the case of the Hindu milieu, we are really talking about visual interaction per se. Moving on to the next example by Deschale. He looks at Tibetan Buddhists living in north central Nepal, and for them, vision is a conduit either of harm or malevolence, or friendship and intimacy. If you look at the first example on the left, misoge, referring to a piercing gaze. Now that stems from an envious position. Yeah, the gaze will pierce or stick into another person's body, making that person sick. Hence, a poisonous position. Whereas for mezinge, which refers to the mutual rapport of eyes, there is eye encounter. For instance, the flirtatious exchange of the glance, or in other contexts of familial or friendship ties. So together, the work of Bab, the work of Deschale, importantly illustrate for us, vision is a differentiated modality. It implies what it means to see, and that's importantly accompanied by localized cultural meanings. Now, from vision, I move to taste and ritual statuses. Here, I want to reiterate, right, the sociocultural significance of the senses beyond description and beyond just recognizing different sense modalities. What do I mean, right? To continue from Kuiper's, now his research shows that taste substances are meaningfully ordered and are multifunctional signs that fit into the context of use, right? So he makes an argument across how taste, ritual, and prohibition or permission come together, thereby looking at the metaphorical uses of taste, right? As you see from the examples here on the slide, the taste of bitterness or blandness, now they are not used with reference to actual gustatory sensations, but ritual statuses of both prohibition as well as permission. And therefore, that really brings up crucially symbolic and ritual significance of taste metaphors. Further examples, and now to think about both taste and smell, is where it brings me to another part of the region in Southeast Asia. And this is where cross-cultural comparability can be found in Enfield's work on taste lexicon between two languages of Lao and Cree in the context of Laos. Lao and Cree, they are Austroasiatic languages, and they are ancient language families where their communities live across much of Southeast Asia and of India. So Lao is a Southwestern Thai language, TAI, spoken by people in Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. And its vocabulary, now it comes with a very distinct set of flavor terms that is contrasted against the English language, as you see on the screen here. So while Lao has the basic set of taste sensations, sweet and sour, there are further nuances, right? Not salty enough or too salty. Now, compare Lao with Cree, which is a language spoken by upland central Laotians, which has some similarities with Lao. For instance, if you look at hot and minty, right? HUN versus HUL in terms of its spelling. So these examples suggest that there could be a borrowing of terms between these two languages, and therefore opens up the possibility to inquire into intra-Asian connections. So this is what I mean by to look at Asia as a site and product of interaction, not just within itself, but also across and perhaps even between different regions for sensory analysis. Now, when we talk about comparison, I also want to think about intersensoriality. So just not to look at a sense modality on its own, but to think about relationships between the senses. Here, I want to think about sensory conjoinment, and I bring us now to early Japan in order to shed light on senses and class dynamics. If we trace the history of incense in Japan, Kodo, or the way of incense, is a favorite pastime of Japanese aristocracy, where connoisseurs would compound incense and then guess the ingredients after burning in conjunction with a tea ceremony. In the 14th century, interestingly, sensory vocabularies are linked to tastes and smells of incense. For instance, a syrup-like aroma connotes sweetness, saltiness refers to perspiration, and a medicinal aroma connotes bitterness. But what's more interesting is the links between sense, texture, and class standing. What do I mean by that? Now, according to the research here in the history of incense, now scents from Manaban or South India are unrefined. It comes with a sweet and gritty texture, and is therefore used in a Japanese context to refer to the figure of the coarse peasant. Now, in converse, rakuku from Thailand comes with bitter and pungent sensations, and it exhibits a warrior's demeanor, right? And is therefore known as the samurai. So it's quite interesting to see how olfaction textures come together and in connection with different socioeconomic standing in 14th century Japan. And also what's interesting is that there is also a practice of listening to incense in kodo, where listening instead of smelling took place from the 14th to the 15th century, which far better convey the required concentration in kodo or way of incense. There underlies here a cosmological explanation, right? Where Buddha's teachings are both to be centered as well as heard. So according to the Mahayana Sutra of Buddhism, Buddha's words are both fragrant incense, and therefore devotees would listen to Buddha's words in the form of incense instead of smelling them. So quite an interesting way to think about smells, textures, and also the different modalities of smelling and listening, cross-cutting social settings as well as being interlinked with religious values. Yeah, so that in a nutshell is my first theoretical theme that I wanted to share, to consider how the senses assume different socio-cultural valence and significance, and therefore is important to go beyond existing 5 sensory models to look at how senses occur in and of themselves in comparison with other models across cultures in Asia and beyond. So that's the first theme. The second theme I come to now has to do with morality as well as social structures. Now, links between senses and morality can be traced to such domains of everyday life, from religion, music, to food, and various other metaphors of consumption. Right? What's interesting here for morality and social structures has to do with values that are desired and positive, as well as those that are negative and frowned upon, and which are indicated through particular sensory behavior. Right? The senses therefore serve as intermediaries of moral binaries between the good and the bad, between the desired and the undesired. So in this context, it illustrates how propriety, improvement of the self, and moral decorum come together as reflected by sensory behavior and sensory exchange. So in order to get at how morality and senses are conjoined, I propose in the book the term sensory moral economies in order to underscore the links between sensory elements and moral principles. So sensory moral economies comprise a constellation of 1, ethical conduct, 2, moral obligation, and 3, bodily knowledge. These 3 are derived from prescriptive religious, philosophical, and other texts that together represent moral decorum in any given society. And for me, this constellation of sensory moral economies serves as an important moral compass that is articulated through sense X, which I examine next. Now, I've already mentioned that the governance of good behavior, the assertion of moral scruples and decorum are expressed through the different senses. So here I borrow from the work of Wilker and Oliver in 2011, where they think about the role and the moral positioning in Sanskrit Hinduism by looking into music and sound. So for these authors, sound is crucial because it possesses the ability to create the sacred and also to act as a latent reinforcement of class and social standing. So here, Wilker and Oliver say that sound is God, show that in your singing, meditate on it, cleanse your karma by it, right? And in the next passage, they argue that in Sanskrit Hinduism, religious reading constitutes a type of knowing, savoring, tasting, where religious readers, they do not always just link importance to content, but they maintain that relationship with text, and more importantly, attitudes that articulate that relationship. Yeah. So in this case, these examples reflect upon everyday religion in very corporeal, very sensorial ways, by denoting as well as connoting certain moral principles. Now, similar links between senses and morality from Sanskrit Hinduism can be traced in early Chinese texts. Here I look at Sturck's work on virtue and taste in early Chinese texts in order to illustrate the links between foodways and taste, as well as ideas of virtue and of theology. Now, Sturck examines regional food varieties and dietary customs through archival Chinese texts, and in these texts, now Chinese attitudes revolving around the following can be traced according to Sturck's work: that of human virtue, of self-cultivation, personal salvation, moral governance, and various other related themes. So in that sense, if we follow Sturck's argument in his archival enterprise on early Chinese texts, it's quite interesting to see how dietary practices, right, dietary items, food dishes, connotes particular virtues, such as we see here, a vegetable broth that seem to typify the diet of a pauper, is associated with frugality as a virtue. And therefore, in order to find peace, sages, worthies, officials who are virtuous, they would stick to a coarse diet of vegetable broths or stews that's lacking in condiments. In that sense, these sorts of foodways traced to early texts in the Chinese history shows us that virtue, conceptions of moral governance and scruples illuminates that sensory attunement is a lens to apprehend moral economies and social structures as well. Now, I wanted to further what I mean by moral binaries of good and evil, desired and undesired, by looking at the relationship of good and evil in religion, as an example, and rituals. So here are three examples that I wanted to share, which is captured in the book, where I think about first the relationship between smell and religious symbolism. So through Klassen et al.'s work, she argues with authors that the odor or sanctity or a mystical fragrance usually is used to describe or signal the presence of the Holy Spirit in Christianity. Now, in comparison, frankincense in Buddhism can indicate the golden countenance of Buddha from afar. So quite interestingly, if I were to juxtapose these two examples together in this slide, it shows us in a nutshell that fragrances, they importantly denote the presence of gods, and moreover, they also connote such virtues of purity or the virtue of cleanliness. Now, on the converse, incense and perfumes, they are also deployed to ward off evil's beings and spirits. So it's quite interesting how scents, fragrances, or stenches can traverse both the positive and the negative, be used within the domain of the good and the evil. To further this idea of moral binaries and polarities, I go next into the example of sound. Now, this is where I borrow the example of an Indonesian tale that is drawn from Ranjak de Laboe. Now, there's a genre of traditional literature that's written by the Minangkabau of Sumatra in the late 18th and early 19th century. Quite interestingly, in the Indonesian tale, what is captured is the laughter of the devil versus the laughter of the prophet. For the laughter of the devil, it is described and characterized as loud and roaring, sounding like a shriek combined with giggling. Contrast that with the laughter of the prophet, right, which is quite simply described as not expressed aloud. So interestingly, the binaries emerge once more to think about how, on one hand, the laughter of the devil is characterized as excessive, if not transgressive, potent and very visible sonically, as opposed to the laughter of the prophet, which is measured, which is firm. You can hear it, but you know that it is a particular sound that is not transgressive, not excessive, not larger than life per se. Right? So it's interesting to see how good versus evil or desired versus undesired, the two polarities are actually dichotomized through different types of laughter as a sonic example. Now, the third example that I wanted to share, and which comes even closer to what I mean by sensory moral economies, is to borrow from the work of Unabia, who writes about the rituals and rites and myths of the Bukidnon of northern Mindanao, Philippines. Now, for Bukidnon and the northern, living in northern Mindanao, smells are employed to deal with one, malevolent spirits, right? So evil spirits, but also two, as offering and as bargaining tools with guardians and helpers of humans. So in order to deal first with malevolent spirits, ritual prayers require the blowing of ginger onto a chicken in order to weaken malevolent spirits. So the smell of ginger is supposed to weaken evil spirits. Now, in terms of using smells as offerings or as a bargaining sense modality with guardians, chickens are presented as offerings to guardians. The chicken is bled in order to demonstrate sincerity and honesty in the delivery of prayers. So that's the act of using food and the senses to present to the guardians, right? Where is the exchange here? Now, if the smell of the cooked chicken and other foods play important roles in praying to guardians, it is a sense act that becomes recruited in a transactional negotiation with Bukidnon guardians, right? When these guardians receive these smells in prayers and through offerings, they are expected to reciprocate by granting the wishes of those who have offered and have prayed to them. So it's quite interesting to see that offerings and prayers are put forward to guardians through the sense of smell and taste, if you like, but there is an expectation of reciprocity. Guardians are expected to reciprocate by granting the wishes of these devotees. So all in all, the three different but yet convergent examples that I just shared shore up ideas of what's good and evil, what's right or wrong, and importantly reflect upon sensory binaries of fragrance versus stench, which are mirrored upon moral binaries of good and evil, right? So these are, for me, complementary sets of polarities which are mapped onto how social actors negotiate with spiritual beings, through sense acts and exchanges, be they benevolent or malevolent, in different cultural contexts of sensory moral economies. So when I pull all these examples together of how the senses and morality work, the overall analysis for this second theoretical proposition show us that sensory moral economies are in effect the product of specific sensory action. Right? I argue that social actors are expected to perform particular ways of being that would actualize alignment with ideal, righteous states or dispositions mediated through the senses. Now, consequently, these acts reflect upon normative moral meaningfulness in a given society, and the outcome of such sense acts is a combination of immaterial interests as well as moral sentiments. Therefore, my deployment of sensory moral economies express processes of exchange, where social actors are supposed to enact particular moral acts through the senses in order to acquire interests beyond the material. The senses therefore bring to light the moral organization of society and social life. So thus far, with the first and second theoretical themes, I have attended to local epistemologies where I examined how sensory scripts of particular cultures structure everyday life. Now, in the third theoretical proposition, if not the fourth, depending on time, I want to come now to address more closely cross-cultural encounters of two or more sets of sensory scripts by analyzing the wider literature on colonialism, migration, and other cross-cultural interfaces. So this brings me to my third theoretical domain, where I ask a simple question, right? How do social actors react to dissimilar sensory ways of being? The impetus for this theoretical line of inquiry is this: to investigate into how the senses help to create mutual impressions of the agents of imperialism as well as their subjects, the local populations. But I want to make more important takeaway points here, which is to mention that sensory scrutiny is bidirectional. It is important to point this out because the colonizers' view is usually privileged in primary sources, but over time, with further expansion of sensory scholarship, I've been fortunate enough to look at primary sources from the colonized point of view, which is important in order to make the case for how sensory evaluation cuts both ways. Right? The other impetus for this theoretical domain is to examine the different forms of cross-cultural sensory contact, right? Like I mentioned, through colonialism, migration, commerce, food and foodways, etc., in order to study and interrogate the different processes of negotiation, adaptation, alteration. And these, for me, are the different modes of sensory engagement that would warrant further sociocultural investigation. The example that you see here, which I borrowed from Moder, if not Tate, shows us the case of Singapore in terms of its foodscape, in terms of its level of hygiene, ethnic landscape, basically social life as it occurs in Singapore from the point of view of a visitor recorded through the senses. So this author is characterizing Singapore as smelly, very hot and humid. It's a noisy place. And it is the whole kaleidoscope of smells and sights that come at your senses, if not assault your senses. So what's interesting here is that foodways, peoples of different backgrounds and jobs, all this constitute assaults on one's senses that envelop you in urbanity, right? So this is a sort of disagreement, if not how different dissimilar sensory scripts come together at a point of interface. Yeah. Now, to further elaborate what I mean by cross-cultural encounters and sensory interface, I want to come to the example of the durian. I think colleagues over in Krakow would have at least tasted or know the idea of the durian, this fruit, usually ingested in the region with a green, hard, spiky case. I'm not so fond of durian per se. I can tolerate eating them, but I reduce eating them, for good reasons of preferring custard, if you like, rather than durian pudding. Yeah, but I think there's a story to tell in terms of durians. So quite clearly through these examples, people disagree on the taste and smell of durian, right? So for Moda, right, the fruit's rather pungent odor gets at sensitive European noses and quite dramatically triggers nausea, triggers vomiting, right? It's not fragrant, it's a stench, and locals yet, run what they know as durian feasts, right? But it's not just sufficient to say people like or do not like particular foods and their smells and tastes. There's a need to go a step further beyond such likes and delights to examine taste, smell, social status, and power relations in more nuanced and critical ways. To do that, I want to borrow from Montanari, who ventures into the relationship of durian and empire, where she makes an important statement that taste needs to be conceived of as a product, if not commodity, of social historical circumstances. Now, her work demonstrates how the fruit is an index that illuminates shifting practices of social class, distinction, and civility over time. If we trace the social life of durian across social historical colonial periods, the early colonial days tell us that it was received as delicious, described as charming, and that was because of less rigid social structures of the time, and therefore, culturally, things were more fluid. Now, when we go on to the next stage of colonialism, from the 17th century onwards, things change. Travel accounts, they compare the fruit unfavorably to, for instance, the onion, right, characterized in Spanish Philippines as coming with an ungrateful taste of onion to the nose. So something that's quite powerful and overwhelming, practically an undesired taste. When we go from the 17th to the 18th century, Montanari tells us that rejectionist attitudes become more apparent, and this is linked to natives' diets, right? Late colonialism in the 18th, going into the 19th century, describes durian, its smell and taste as unclean, unchaste, and it connotes such undesirables of gluttony, of one being intemperate as well as irrational. So this is where in the later stage of colonialism, that boundaries between civility and barbarism were made pronounced. Now, what's the larger point here to note is that of colonial sensory pathology. And this idea of colonial sensory pathology can also be applied to other colonial contexts within the region. What do I mean by that? Colonial sensory pathology is charged upon local populations in both contexts of the British in India as well as the American in the Philippines, according to Rotter's historical work. So again, that avails an opportunity for comparison, right? Local sensory behavior have been interpreted as transgressive and thereby pathological, which importantly then serves as justification for sensory paternalism, control, and regulation. So the next two examples that I want to show, including the one here, indicate how sensory scrutiny runs in opposite directions, right? Like I mentioned before, even if archival historical data privileges the point of view of the colonizers, it's also important to bring back the balance by looking at the experiences of the colonized or the local populations. Yeah. So these are examples that I want to borrow from Callow, who talks about ethnic otherness mediated through olfaction. So Kello studied sensory experiences in World War II, and she makes a case for how older evaluations illuminate American anti-Asian prejudice against the Japanese, where American soldiers racially stereotyped the Japanese, including the Nisei, who were American soldiers of Japanese descent, calling them, I quote, third-grade sardines, pigs, skunk cabbage, who come with the heavy odor of fish and garlic. Now, on one hand, such zoomorphic dehumanization widen the distinction between self and enemy, and ethnic denigration, Kellogg argues, translates into cultural inferiority. Now, on the other hand, the Japanese also held similar animalistic views of the Americans, calling them ibisu or savages, who come with, I quote, the breath and body odor of the beast. So when sensory scrutiny is presented as bidirectional, they come together with similar themes. Here we are looking at the notion of pollution, the notion of otherness through animalistic characterization, and such scrutiny cuts both ways. Now, so this is what I mean by when two different groups come together and when they adhere, excuse me, when they adhere to different sensory ways of being, that moment of interface tells us how sensory hierarchies are built into the picture. Excuse me. Now, I want to further the example by borrowing from Anne Stoller, who examines colonial categories and intimacy, where she conducted oral history interviews with Indonesian men and women who worked for the Dutch in the 1920s to the 1950s, and to think about oral history interviews as a form of subaltern memory. Her research tells us that if Dutch memoirs shore up sensory nostalgia, the Dutch remembering, I quote, the veil-like material of the servant's kebaya gently grazing my cheek, or the fragrance of her body and her clothes, of her sarong especially, end quote. It's interesting to see the other side of things. What about these Javanese servants' accounts of the Dutch, right? Now, the Dutch did not allow their children to be always carried by the servants because they didn't want the children to be soaked in the sweat of the Javanese. And interestingly, the response comes from one of the Javanese servants, Ibu Ruby, who says, I quote, the Dutch sweat smells worse because they eat butter, milk, and cheese. So interestingly, this is an exemplification of disdain, of rejection of the colonizers' sensory conduct, thereby othering them as well. Now, as I sought to uncover these moments of sensory interfaces, I also wanted to derive a template to explain and to analyze how these interfaces come about and what's the sociocultural significance. So to do that, I came up with 4 modes of sensory engagement, what I labeled as reception, rejection, regulation, and reproduction. And these 4 R's, I conceive of them in order to problematize colonial local sensory encounters, where these encounters importantly stem from contrasting, if not unequal, power positions. And through these 4 R's, I hope it avails a different understanding of empire through all its sensorialities. So I just briefly run through with examples of the 4 R's. Reception, we saw initially through the example of the durian, there were at first positive attitudes towards the durian, right? Charming, pleasant, delectable. Rejection is where we trace from reception to later disapprobation against the durian, right? Revealing the emergence of a colonial sensory pathology charged upon local populations or the foreign other, hence rejection. Through rejection, then also comes regulation. And then this is where the British in India and the Americans in Philippines saw themselves as civilizers of backward societies, where they assumed the role of regulating sonic behavior. Belching, farting were deemed impolite. Sonic manners were taught in schools. English was taught in, I quote, native schools in the hope of making, quote, Asians sound less strange and more like civilized people, unquote. So that's from Rotter 2011. When it comes to reproduction, I take reproduction to mean the imitation of the other's sensory script. And both colonizers and colonized do reproduction, right? So for instance, Indianized habits and tastes, now they were brought back from India to the UK in the 1700s. For instance, curry and rice became an important feature in the UK. And on the other hand, subalterns also strove to acquire Western manners by championing sanitation, health campaigns, or eat with forks and knives and not with fingers, right? So the 4 R's collectively demonstrate the importance of tracing shifts and changes in sensory habits for different social groups and how such sensory habits can traverse between regions, countries, between colonized locations as well as empire. The 4 R's therefore avail further insights into how social structures, status differentiation, and cultural norms revolving around the senses develop across time, both within and between particular social groups and locations. Now, additionally, I iterate that rejection and reproduction are not always the sole privilege of those in power, just as in the case of Ibu Ruby shows, where for her the Dutch smelled worse because of the foods that they consume. Now, apart from the 4 R's that I've used as a template to explain sensory interfaces in cross-cultural encounters, I wanted to stretch the idea of reproduction or rejection to see these as a response both to settler colonialism as well as to colonial cultural hegemony. I wanted to use the next 3 examples from Taiwan to British Malaya and China to illustrate what I mean by responses to hegemony as well as to settler colonialism. The first example I draw from Hatfield's work on indigenous peoples of Taiwan. For many centuries, these peoples have endured the arrival of colonialists of different groups, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, Sinophone settler colonialists, as well as Qing dynasty imperial armies. In 1877, Qing armies annexed Sepulpanca with a massacre, and then they absorbed the place into the state system. Now, in response, Sepulpanca asserted their presence through frog voices, school chimes, or songs. What do I mean by that? Now, or rather, what did Hatfield mean by that? Now, frog voices resembled the laments of elderly women in the wake of the massacre of 1877, where youths were ambushed at the banquet and who were killed subsequently, right? So for the author, these frog voices have been recruited as media for indigenous histories. They can be interpreted as a decolonizing strategy and to be conceived as sensory rejection forming a political project. So quite an interesting snippet there of how settler colonialism is being responded to, if not rejected, through frog voices that has already been recruited in the historical narrative of the 1877 massacre. From Taiwan in East Asia, I come to Southeast Asia to look at British Malaya during the colonial times of the 18 and 1900s. Now, this is where local Malay entertainers and musicians, they produced their own hybrid theatre and music. Now, they did not merely replicate Anglo-American culture, but instead merged diverse cultures in their performances and therefore crucially challenged imperial aesthetics and cultures through hybridity. One example is traced to how Malay opera blended new stories and songs from European and other parts of Asian performances and cultures. Elements were borrowed also from India, from Java, from the Chinese, as well as Arabic cultures. So this is another interesting way through the medium of theatre, music, and performance that instead of a clear-cut rejection of colonial aesthetic imposition, there was a borrowing and hybridization, thereby forming their own version of what is art. Right? So this new repertoire of Malay modern songs, for instance, consequently paved the way for advocating change among Malay audiences. Ideas pertaining to reform, to progress and advancement formed part and parcel of these new musical forms and the messages that they conveyed. Now, when I come to the third example, I want to quickly go through the case of wartime China and Japanese guards by borrowing Geng's work. So the Japanese occupation in World War II saw the imprisonment of many in internment camps all over the region. Now, Geng's example of one such camp is traced to the Shandong province in China, where internees in the camp, they forge a sense of belonging and community through their creative engagement with music and sound. They express their views on involuntary confinement in these camps. What's interesting here through her research is that music and sound had a dual purpose in these camps. On the one hand, music and sound were used to discipline, to manage interns, right? The Japanese guards, they closely monitored music that is performed and practiced by the interns. They can only practice and perform in designated places, and the Japanese guards also forbade musical activities that may proclaim the internees' allegiance to their kings, their queens, or to the allied governments. So that meant that no national anthems or patriotic songs could be performed. They would otherwise be outlawed, right? Any musical productions that portrayed the Japanese government or army negatively were also not tolerated. Doing so may result in harsh punishments ranging from solitary confinement and beatings as well, right? So that's one hand on how music and songs are tools of discipline exacted by the Japanese guards. On the other hand, the internees, they created new forms of auditory expression in order to defy, to protest, and to resist Japanese control. They use music to warn their fellow internees of the approach of patrolling guards. They creatively improvise the lyrics to transmit secret messages, or they omitted lyrics of forbidden songs in order to be able to practice them even in secret. So overall, the author suggests an important rethinking of how sound and music are deployed in context of oppression, occupation, and persecution, and importantly shows us that such reproduction counts as important response or as a decolonizing strategy, right, to colonial powers that may be in different countries across different power relations. So through the various examples that I've just shared, I think it's important to not just present colonial, but also local subjectivities or the colonized through closer examination of these different examples of sensory interfaces. As a result, these three examples that I'm presenting of responses of resistance demonstrate how the senses are articulating different vantage positions, and they accord shape and meaning to asymmetric relations across a variety of colonial contexts and spaces. I'm thinking I should have enough time to venture into the fourth theme. I promise that this is my final theoretical proposition before I wrap up my presentation. So just to add on beyond the three theoretical themes, a fourth point on gastrodiplomacy, which comes a little closer to today and tomorrow's workshop, the book project on heritage, census, and mobility. Now, this fourth theoretical theme has to do with the gastrodiplomacy, where I was interested to locate the nexus between food senses, and political life, right? I make a case for food as a political object in diplomatic relations, how food as gifts and acts of commensality of eating together are routinely built into both local and foreign policy. My argument for this theoretical domain is that gastropolitical encounters, they form the nexus between the political and the sensible. The political clearly has to do with manifold statecraft and political behavior, whilst the sensible refers to the capacity for sense perception, including the deployment of sensory metaphors. Now, the key takeaway that I wanted to express through gastrodiplomacy as a theoretical theme is that food as gifts serves as an intermediary of sensory power. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look at the pictures that I've borrowed from online on the right of the screen, this is an American couple, Kirk Varga, the US-American ambassador in Singapore, together with his wife, was invited by a local food blogger, Dr. Leslie Tay, the one here, to appreciate and consume local foods. So here they are trying bak kut teh or pork rib soup with intestines, rice and vegetables as a local dish for them to try. What's interesting is that the reportage tells us through the process of trying, learning how to eat with chopsticks, this is where food blogger Leslie Tay introduced to them, using the opportunity, a brief history of Singapore's food, right? And thereby conjoining it to the national identity of Singapore. There's a second episode to that, and this for me nicely comes full circle to the example of durian. So Kirk and his wife, they enjoyed the pork rib soup. They appreciated the intense taste because this is a soup made up of different spices and herbs. It's got a peppery, strong flavor, consumed with meats, with intestines, with vegetables and eggs. So they were pleasantly surprised despite the intensity of the dish and the accompanying dishes and condiments. And then Leslie Tay challenged Kirk and his wife 2 years later to eating the durian, right? I think you can see from the picture that Kirk was not at all happy. His initial reaction to the durian was that this looks like a string of yellow intestines, whereas his wife remarked that, well, the texture looks a bit soft like custard. What's interesting is that his wife was able to take to the taste, but Kirk wasn't happy at all with the taste, although he was game and adventurous enough to try. Now, when I put these different examples together, it is not just a case of what foreign dignitaries or political leaders or representatives eat. Rather, built within those gastropolitical encounters in the realm of gastrodiplomacy is how food as gifts can serve two purposes. The first of which is to convey, even briefly, a sense of heritage of a nation, of its culture, of its foodways, through food as a gift, and through food that is sensorially experienced. And two, the more important purpose in this case would be how, as a gift, food also assumes a kind of soft power in mediating both local and foreign political relationships. What do I mean by that? Well, that's because if political powers and relations are always seemingly objective, formal, structured, food and foodways and heritage gifts provides an oblique connection between locals and foreigners, for which then gastro-diplomatic ties are furthered. Yeah. So in that sense, I'm interested to venture into the political life of sensation in this fourth domain, and to think about how metaphors of taste and other sense experience come with socio-political consequences and aims. So with that, as promised, I come now to my final slide, which is to wrap up the presentation. Now, to the 3, if not 4, theoretical domains and multiple examples that I shared, my quest in this book project was to respond not just to oculocentrism, but also to Western-centric endeavors in sensory scholarship. So my book, therefore, I hope have expanded and further explore the terrain of sensory inquiry using Asia as a point in case. Now, I've raised both theoretical and methodological directions in studying sensory practices and ideologies emanating from Asian contexts through the 4 theoretical propositions shared today. But I also wanted to stress the different scales of analysis, right, in terms of local indigenous framing, in terms of the different points of engagement, as well as different possibilities and potentials of comparison. I want to emphasize finally that the senses quite clearly do not work in isolation as Western aesthetics would have it. They are not always static in practice and experience. They are importantly historically contingent, they are socially constructed, and they are definitely operative through multiple frames of cultural perception, just as my template of the 4 R's illustrate. In some, sensory practices are interactive, they are dialogic, and they do change and modify over time. So this, within the hour, has been my attempt to share different parts of the book, Sensory Anthropology, and to anchor my talk, this keynote address, through the 4 theoretical propositions. And with that, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Kelvin, for this very inspiring lecture. You have shown us a very constructive and informative overview of the works that go way beyond the Western perspective on senses and multisensoriality. We, I think, have received from you a good both theoretical and methodological tools to proceed with our chapters. And what I especially liked about what you've presented is that you indeed showed us with examples that the senses and multisensoriality is very much culturally rooted and constructed, even though we take it for granted within our own cultural contexts. So I would like to open the floor for the discussion now, for questions. We will be accepting the questions from both the room and from our online participants. So please feel free to write the questions also in the chat, or to just raise your hand in case you wanna ask it orally, vocally. We are not following the chat on YouTube, so our followers on YouTube, please just switch to the link on Teams if you want to ask questions. All right, so I welcome questions.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. I just have, perhaps to start, a very broad question. The relevance of vision in Western context is well known. And I was just sort of wondering if there is any sense that you think there is predominant in an Asian context as there is in a Western context vision.
Thank you for the question. There are actually a lot of examples that one could think of and venture into. For instance, smells. I think was it in Indonesia that the sense of smell has to do with 2 realms. One is the spiritual realm and one is the human realm. So it's a matter of local cosmology, religious association, and symbolism that they organize social life according to smells in the 2 different realms. So as a quick example, I think this importantly shows us that even as vision may sit at the top of the hierarchy, particularly in Western context, if not history, this is important to shift the lens around, to think about whether there are other senses beyond the visual that also occupy a primary positioning. And that's what I meant by it's not just enough to know how the other senses operate within a given culture and the modalities, but also how they are placed within hierarchies. So that's one amongst many examples to think about how it can serve as an equivalent of how if sight is accorded that sort of a hegemonic position, in this case, smell is the one occupying the hegemonic position on the hierarchy of the senses.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
There you go. Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very inspiring, but I wanted to ask you whether you encountered some accounts about people who have restricted senses and what's their role, I would say, in a social hierarchy, because in Europe, probably you know, in ancient Greece, we have this figure of blind wise man, yes, who are studying prophecies and bringing. So here, restriction of some senses can put people higher in the social hierarchy. But I was interested how it goes with Asia or some Asian cultures.
Well, both in Asia and beyond, and this I'm referring to my very first book that came out many years ago on smell, where I've encountered and interviewed not only people with a sense of smell, but also those who do not have the ability to smell. So individuals who are anosmic. And for those of us who are familiar with the medical literature, there are different categories of anosmia, right? Those who are born without the sense of smell, or those who might have gone through a terrible cold or an accident for which then they lose their sense of smell later on in life. And then there are those whose body imagines smells that are evidently not there. So there's all different kinds of ways to think about the absence of a sense. Medically, what's the range? But socially, what's the consequence? So when I've interviewed people who do not have a sense of smell, either through accident or by birth, my question to them was that if you can't smell, is smell still important in your life? You know, all of them said yes, and in different degrees. What do I mean by that? For instance, someone who had an accident and subsequently lost his sense of smell said, I very much regret not being able to smell the smell of my children when they were growing up. I very much miss, the smell of autumn in the air. I can only hear the crackling of dried leaves on the ground. I can see the colors changing, but I'm missing smell. And that affects my quality of life. That intrudes into my relationship with my family. If I can't appreciate their unique bodily odors as their bodily signature. On the other hand, when I spoke to someone who was born without a sense of smell, he said, of course, smell is still very much important, because I had one discussion where we talk about the presentation of self, right? Through Goffmanian approaches. How is it important to prepare yourself in the backstage to make sure you are wearing clean clothes, you don't smell bad. You may use body deodorants, perfumes, or colognes to smell nice before you socially interact. So I said, how do you do that if you can't smell? He says, number one, whenever he goes shopping for cologne, he will bring along his brother who can smell and use him as the guinea pig. Does this scent fit me, what you know of me, my personality, my character? If so, I'll purchase this cologne because you told me so. I'm borrowing your nose. Another example, he says that I have a free ticket to fart, because I can't smell the odor transgression that emanates from my body. I do not have to follow the so-called social protocol of inhibiting our bodily gas release. And he says he is able to use toilets anywhere in the world because he can't smell, so nothing affects him. So I think it's interesting to see how, one, there's a whole range when we think about the absence of a smell or a sense, and also, more importantly, to come to now the interface between the biomedical as well as the sociocultural. And in the case of my research on smell in Singapore and beyond, it was interesting to see how the absence of smell signifies a lower quality of life, but at the same time, it can also mean a further bolstering of one's identity because he feels confident that he wears a clean shirt. To end off this example, I asked him, how do you know a shirt is clean if you can't smell it apart from looking at it? He says, I will wear a shirt 2 times. Before I wear it the 3rd time, I will take that shirt, dangle it in front of, as you can guess, his poor brother. If it's not stinky, he will wear it for another time. So there you go, right? The absence of a particular sense makes people respond in varied creative ways, and also self-introspection of how has their life been affected positively or otherwise.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yes, please, Thais.
Thank you very much for your speech, Kelvin. It helped me a lot to reflect about senses. And I was thinking about the better ways that we as researchers can do this kind of investigation. So methods and techniques that we could that could help us to interpret and analyze especially the intersensorialities.
Thanks. Thanks for your question. I think it is both a question about methodology as well as analysis. So I think all of us who are already now very much involved in sensory scholarship would appreciate that the senses as a point of inquiry, both as an object and subject of inquiry, requires a bit more creative methods of research and data generation. So one of the important ways to do that would be through what David House calls as participant sensation, for which the senses of the researcher did not necessarily be parked at the door when we conduct sensory studies, right? Precisely because we as social beings, as social actors, have also been socialized with a particular set of sensory scripts and behaviors, which may or may not be in alignment with those whom we study. So I think that is the point of interface for which we should acknowledge and be reflexive about. Now, with that positionality, I think that is important if we were to do, for instance, smellscapes walkabout with respondents. So that's what I did, where I brought my interlocutors to different ethnic enclaves in Singapore, Chinatown, Little India, Little Bangkok, and being very mindful of how I would smell the area. I instead open up with a broader question, right? In the lines of phenomenology and ethnomethodology, by asking, tell me what you experience here. So I was also very careful that although it was a study, a book on olfaction, I did not want to use olfaction as a point of departure unless interlocutors tell me so, right? And then it's interesting to see how smell also works quite clearly and in conjunction with the other senses. Now, what do I mean by that? So for instance, they would say, look, across the road, there's a group of people there. I think they are foreign workers from South Asia working in Singapore, and therefore they probably would smell bad. So I said, how? Why? How do you know that? We are like, across the street. And so they were saying, yeah, South Asian populations in Singapore, a segment of them work in construction work. So quite clearly, right, bodily sweats are the order of the day, even if they're dressed in their Sunday best. So it was a Sunday that we were walking in Little India. She said, I can see that they're wearing shirts tucked into pants, their Sunday best, but it's crumpled. As much as they've tried their hardest, I think they are from South Asia, they are in foreign construction work, and therefore they are smelly. So that kind of a judgment, right, both through the sense of smell or imagined smell associated with sight, becomes the media through which different populations, in the example of Singapore, is being constructed. To affirm that when we walk closer to this group of people, she consciously took a deep breath and said, see, I'm right, they don't smell so nice. But that's her point of view. But it's interesting to see how smell, sight conjoin together to construct for her a particular group in Singapore as a foreign population. Yeah. So I think in terms of analysis, we have to be mindful, if not reflexive, about how we can convey different sensory experiences, which for me continues to be a challenge, because if the senses are embodied, visceral, corporeal, are words sufficient to articulate sense experience? So the answer is sort of yes and no. I mean, yes, quite clearly, because apart from print as a medium, what I shared earlier about Mark Smith, to both articulate and identify sensory experience, there are different other ways to illustrate the senses, right? Through audiovisual methods. There's a researcher by the name of Simon Chu, someone whom I like to share and quote quite often, because he was looking at student migrants from Malaysia to Australia and how they maintain their sense of identity through food, heritage, and the mobile senses, right? So they eat a particular kind of skewered meat, satay, right? Satay babi, pork satay. And in the conference presentation that he was presenting his work, he was cooking and preparing that dish to share with members of the audience. So for him as a researcher, he was literally bringing the senses to the academic environment, that is the conference, in order for participants to experience firsthand how the senses for the student migrants that he studied felt like in situ. Right? So I think in some ways for us who are invested into sensory scholarship, the challenges are there that are thrown at us for methodology and analysis, but I think the creative impulse and provision can be limitless so long as we find a durable, ethical, and clear way of articulating the data that we collect and the analysis that we put forward.
Thank you. Any other questions? I do have a question, if you allow me. So we know it's clear from your answers, from your lectures, that senses are a crucial part of social life and are especially important in a context of, well, I don't want to call it a cultural meeting, but in a context of intercultural encounters, multicultural studies as well, migration studies. But somehow, even though, as you showed, as you have shown, and as we can read from the literature, even though the senses can project on social inequalities in a very serious way, they have not made their way as a topic, as methodology, as a theory to the mainstream migration studies, mobility studies, sociology. So I guess this is a question that goes beyond your lecture, but I guess I would like to ask you to reflect a little bit on the challenges these sensory approaches encounter in entering the mainstream. And, well, I don't know if you can comment on what we can do to overcome it, but at least to reflect on these challenges.
Thanks, Carolina, for pointing that out. To be frank, that's for me a lifelong challenge in academia, because when I first started on sensory research through smell, I think a good 20 years ago, those were precisely the reactions that were triggered and generated. Oh, so are you going around smelling people? Ha ha ha. Oh, so you go to smelly places? Ha ha ha. So on and so forth. And people found it difficult to place sensory research in mainstream domains of inquiry. So labels were thrown all over the place. This is postmodern, is avant-garde, is unorthodox, is marginal, is not mainstream. But I like to be optimistic. That was 20 years ago. And I think with colleagues smiling in the room, as I can see through the screen now, sensory scholarship has come a very long way, and importantly so, to stand on its own as a legitimate and important source of research and inquiry. Why do I say that? Now, there are different indicators to think about it. If we look at, broadly speaking, sociological, anthropological curriculum all over the world, in different departments in the world, in universities, you can find a module on the senses. In conjunction, you could most likely also find a module on emotions and affect. And you could find a module on sociology of food. that might not have been the case 20, even 30 years ago. So I think that the pace of research on the body, emotions, and now senses as we come has taken traction quite rapidly. And, sort of intersected with the different domains of orthodox or mainstream, to think about migration, to think about heritage, mobility, politics, class inequalities. That's one way to think about it. Now, and another way to consider why the senses were always submerged and never quite surfaced until recently is through the archives. I've just come off finishing two different chapters of food heritage and the senses. And one of the arguments I made was to have to revisit the archives, to taste the senses, to smell the senses through the archives again, because there's a treasure trove, an important repository of historical data that was seldom, if not at all, analyzed through the senses. Right? But in today's context, I think it's such rich material and platform to think about how the senses have always been present, as we all know in everyday life, because it is both biological and sociocultural. So I think if you were to draw the lens back and broader, it's always been there, but the nature and dynamic of disciplines such as sociology and anthropology in the social sciences, or in the humanities, history, philosophy, geography, somehow there is what David House would call as a sensory revolution, right? We can go into the archives, we can go into a sociology or literature, we can look at travel writing, personal letters, photography, and provide that sensory spin, which I think increasingly becomes more and more important. And I like to think that us in this group together are also contributing pertinently to developing the field. So Carolina, I absolutely agree with you that the beginning was difficult. It will still take time for sensory scholarship to grow. There could be detractors, but never mind. I think a newer field such as sensory scholarship has its beginnings, but I think we are also starting to see its glory days as well. So I like to be optimistic in terms of where sensory scholarship may develop from here on. And the book that you guys are all vested into now is definitely one important step moving forward.
Thank you. Can I? Okay, I think we can accommodate two quick questions. Maybe we can collect them. Sabine and Amandine.
It is just also about methodology, and I was asking myself. I recently saw a couple of citizen science projects working with like trying to map sensescapes of certain cities. I saw it in Czech Republic and in Austria and so on. So I was just wondering if you have any experiences about this idea of participatory research, not only with having partners like respondents working with you as a researcher, but using this kind of quantitative citizen science approaches.
I haven't had the opportunity to do that, but I think I'm aware of colleagues both with my university and beyond, where they harness such quantitative approaches or technologies to think about how different segments of a population in urban neighborhoods, right, respond to and use different parts of a housing estate. So I was previously collaborating with a colleague from architecture and design, and we were trying to figure out for the elderly as a population in a particular housing estate in Singapore, how do they maneuver, right, build infrastructures in their neighborhood through the senses, knowing that biologically their sensory capacities are starting to diminish, right? So even the angle of a slope, the number of steps, the height of the steps, railings or otherwise, are very important for urban design, not just for the general populace, but also for other populations for which the sensory may be a challenge rather than to be a medium of knowledge and bodily information. So there are these various other studies that are going on, and this is one great example of how the sensory is important in, for instance, such a mainstream topic of elderly mobility in built-up environments. So I think it's important to also acknowledge and come face-to-face with not just the qualitative aspects of sociocultural meanings of senses, but also quantitative dynamics, and more importantly, digital technologies that can further broaden the scope of sensory inquiry. So that's another feather to the cap of the sensory methodology platform.
Amandine?
Thank you very much. I was wondering if we could retrain our senses, like after 20 years of studying that, do you have new senses? And the second was, do we have also creative ways to disseminate? So not only how can we collect in a multisensorial way, but actually convene this to other audiences that can be further away, or I'm thinking about like this academic event, for instance, like rather than the visual or audio.
Thanks for your questions. The first one, I think I'm a biologically sensitive person, so I react to smells and sounds. But in terms of acquiring new senses, probably not, except in terms of cultural differentiation, what I shared through my presentation earlier on. But coming now to the second question, I think is that, I mean, there's a lot of possibilities in terms of how we can disseminate sensory data and material. And if you think about, for instance, magazines, right? Fashion magazines. Now, they started since the age of print advertisement, that there is a scratch and sniff, component to advertising perfumes and colognes, right? So that's a way of harnessing print media as an olfactory technology, so to speak. I understand in the field of e-commerce, inventors are also trying to come up with smells that envelop and characterize product or commodity, and for which can be emitted through the computer, our hard disk, the CPU, right? I remember one of my birthdays, someone who knew me well enough that I'm a sensory scholar bought for me a USB stick that could act as an aroma diffuser by simply sticking it into the USB portal, putting a few drops of essential oil, and there you go. It generates that room scent. So I think there are plenty of possibilities, especially in e-commerce, that avails itself to disseminating sensory experiences. One final example could be that of museums. I think over time, at least in the last 5 to 10 years, museums have become even more interactive, right? They're not just presenting placards or 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional ways of interacting with museum goers, be they locals or foreign visitors and tourists, but they are providing hands-on experiences for museum goers. Take, for instance, in Singapore a few years ago, we had a Singapore History Gallery of 4 other galleries, fashion, food, occupations, and something else. So in the food gallery, this is where they wanted to allow consumers to pull a canister, which was, of course, prepared, that contained the smell of different spices and herbs, right? And for consumers to guess, is this pepper or cinnamon or what have you? But interestingly, before they were able to produce such smell canisters for consumers or visitors to pull and whiff, I asked them, what other smells did you experiment with? So they were saying, since we are a national museum, we need to present national identity. We thought food and smells was the usual suspect, the easiest suspect. For those in the audience who knows examples of Singapore's national dishes, chicken rice, chili crab. So the museum said they did try to reproduce the smell of chicken rice, but it became too complicated because of different components, right? Clearly the chicken itself, the chicken stock, the chili, the rice, the vegetables. So they were not able to come up with multimodal reconstruction of smells of a dish, but instead had to go down to individual singular herbs in order to be reconstructed and reproduced in the context of a museum. So I think all these would be lined up as different forms and avenues of sensory consumption that we can see and experience around us. And I think, again, coming back to digital technologies, possibilities are pretty much infinite. But if you were to ask me, frankly, I think I'm more old-fashioned rather than forward-looking, digitally speaking, sort of a tech dinosaur. So for me, I think pen and paper is still the way to go. I might take on Simon Chu's approach to treat people to satay in the conference, if I were to venture further into my area on food heritage and the senses. But I think by and large, possibilities are infinite for how sensory data and experiences can both be collated as well as disseminated.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kelvin, for this inspiring lecture. We don't have more time for questions, but I'm sure I'm speaking not only for myself when I say that what we've experienced here will help us to go out of our sensory comfort zones regarding our theories, methodologies, and approaches. So thank you very much. Thank you for the discussion. Thanks to our online audiences. We continue with our program. Please, our participants, Kelvin, Julia, Lucy, switch to another room. And we meet again at 12 o'clock as the program says. Many thanks again to everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.